The rope on the windlass was frayed down to maybe 4 strands by the time I got there. I noticed that first, not the woman, the rope. That's how a man's mind works after 30 years of reading country. He sees what's broken before he sees what's breathing. The windlass rope was dark with old grease and split at the wrap point, and if anyone cranked that handle without knowing, the whole bucket assembly would drop, and whoever was holding it would go with it. I filed it away. I'd fix it before I left. Then I saw her. She was standing at the well's stone lip with both hands out in front of her, patting the air, slow and careful, the way you do when you're moving through a room you know well but someone's shifted the furniture. She was feeling for the handle. She couldn't find it. The handle was right there, 2 hands to her left, but she couldn't see it, and she didn't know which way to turn, and there was something in her face that wasn't panic yet but was close. A held breath kind of close. I got off my horse. I didn't call out. When you call out to a blind person who doesn't know you're there, you scare them. I'd learned that from my grandmother, who lost her sight the last 8 years of her life, and she told me once, don't announce yourself with your voice from a distance. Come close first, make a sound with your feet, then speak soft. So I walked the horse to the post, tied him, and walked to within 10 feet of the woman and let my boot heel come down firm on the packed earth, and I said quietly, the handle is to your left. About 2 hands. She didn't flinch the way a frightened person flinches. She went still the way a listening person goes still. There's a difference. She turned her head toward my voice, not toward where she thought I was standing, but exactly toward me, which told me her hearing was sharp, which often happens with people who have lost one sense. And then she found the handle with her left hand, closed her fingers around it and said, thank you. That was all. Thank you. Not who are you or where did you come from or any of the 20 questions a person might reasonably ask when a stranger's voice appears out of the open plain. I said, don't crank that yet. She stopped. The rope's bad, I said. I'm going to replace it before you draw. She said, there's spare rope in the lean-to on the north side of the house. I found it. Coiled hemp, good rope, not new but sound. It took me about 20 minutes to re-rig the windlass. The old rope had wound itself into the drum mechanism, and I had to work the knot loose with my knife. And while I worked, I could hear her standing there, not moving much, just standing in the way a person stands when they've decided to wait and are at peace with waiting. When I had it done, I said, all right, it'll hold now. She cranked the handle. The bucket went down clean. She brought it up full and lifted it off the hook one-handed with a practiced tilt, and set it on the flat stone beside the well without spilling anything. And then she reached into the bucket and checked the water with 2 fingers, tasted it, nodded to herself. She said, you're not from the settlement. No. You came from the north. Yes. Lakota. Yes. She nodded again, not surprised, not unsettled. She said, my husband knew a Lakota man, traded horses with him for 11 years. He said they were the finest judges of horseflesh he ever met. I said, that's generally true. She almost smiled. Not quite. There was grief sitting under her face that was too recent for smiling, but the shape of it was there. My name, the one my people gave me, translates roughly as he who quiets the horses. The settlers in the valley below had shortened it to something easier for their tongues. They called me Caleb, which was a name I'd taken for trading purposes 20 years ago and never much cared for, but I answered to it. I was 53 years old. I had been a war chief when I was young, which is a thing you say plainly not because you're proud of it in the way young men are proud of things, but because it's a fact. The way your height is a fact. The way the scar on your left forearm is a fact. I had been sent. That's the word for it, sent. The elder council of my band had heard through the trade network that a settler woman, a widow, was alone on the creek claim 20 miles north of the valley settlement, and that she was blind, and that the fall was coming, and that if someone didn't ride up to check on her situation, she might not survive the winter. The council had sent me not because I was young and strong, I wasn't particularly, not anymore, but because I was known to the settlers and they weren't afraid of me, and because I spoke good English, and because I was, as our elder stands in mourning put it, patient in difficult circumstances, which I had always taken as a polite way of saying I didn't talk too much. I had ridden 2 days to get here. I hadn't expected to feel anything particular when I arrived. A welfare check, a thing you did because it was right to do it, the way you fix a broken, windlass rope before you leave because that's just how you move through the world. You see what needs doing and you do it. But there had been something in her face when she was reaching for that handle, something in the particular quality of her stillness, and there had been something in the way she said thank you, not with the nervousness of someone performing gratitude to a stranger they're afraid of, but with the directness of someone who means the words exactly and doesn't add anything to them. I noticed it. I didn't think about what it meant. I just noticed it. Her name was Marin. She told me that when I asked, standing in her yard while she carried the water bucket to the cabin. She walked without a cane, which surprised me. She had the whole property mapped in her memory, every rock and rut and slope, and she moved across it the way I move across country I know well, with confidence that looks like ease to someone watching. The cabin was small but tight, well built. Her husband had known what he was doing. The chimney was good stone, the sills were packed, the door fit its frame without a gap. She'd kept it up, no rotting wood, no loose shingles I could see. The woodpile beside the north wall was stacked right, angled in to shed rain. She set the bucket inside and came back to the doorway and said, "You should stay tonight. It'll be dark in 2 hours and there's weather coming from the northwest." I looked northwest. She was right. There was a bruised color to the cloud line that meant cold rain, maybe before midnight. I said, "I don't want to put you out." She said, "I made venison stew this morning. There's too much of it for one person." A pause. "That's not me being polite, it's practical." I stayed. We ate by the fire. She moved around the cabin with an economy I've only seen in people who have accepted their condition fully and made peace with what it asks of them. She knew where every pot was, every spoon, every jar of dried herb on the shelf above the window. She had the kind of order that blind people build, not the order of someone who likes neatness, but the order of someone who depends on it absolutely. Every object had its place and stayed in it. The stew was good, better than good. She put something in it I couldn't quite identify, something bitter at the back of it that cut the richness of the venison. I asked her what it was. She said, "Juniper berries, my mother's way. People around here think I'm strange for it." I said, "We use juniper in ceremonies, and sometimes in food. It tastes like something being cleaned." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, that's exactly what it tastes like." She asked me about the council, about how long the ride had been. She asked good questions, specific questions, not the vague, polite ones people ask when they don't really want the answer. She wanted to know about the condition of the trail at the creek crossing, whether the ford was still shallow enough for a wagon, what the grass looked like on the North Flats. She was assessing, storing information, the way a person does when they're running a place alone and need to know everything about the country around them. I told her what I'd seen. When we finished eating, she sat back and said, "My husband died in April." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry." "He was a good man," she said, not defensively, not the way people say it when they're trying to convince you or themselves, just as a plain fact. "He was 31 years older than me and we had 17 years and I have never once regretted it." She turned her face, which was her way of looking toward the fire. "People thought it was strange, the age difference, and that I was blind. They thought he'd taken on a burden." She didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. I said, "People who think that don't understand what a capable woman is worth." She turned her face toward me. Not toward where she thought I was, exactly toward me again. I'd been moving while we talked, leaning forward to set my bowl down back again, and she tracked all of it without seeming to. She said, "Where did you learn to say something like that?" I said, "From my mother." She was quiet for a while after that. Good quiet, not uncomfortable, not the silence of something unsaid, just two people sitting by a fire after a meal. The rain started around midnight. We could hear it on the roof, good sound, a clean sound. I was on the floor near the door with a blanket she'd given me, and she was in the back room, and the fire had burned down to a low red glow. I lay there and didn't sleep for a while. I thought about what Stans in mourning had said when he sent me. Go see if she's all right. That's all he'd said. It was a small task, a practical one. I thought about her face at the well, that held breath expression, the patience in the way she stood and waited while I fixed the rope. I didn't know yet what I was thinking. I just let the thoughts move the way you let a river move. You don't chase it, you just watch it go. I stayed 3 days. I hadn't planned to. The first morning I looked at the woodpile and did the arithmetic split wood, projected cold cubic feet of space in that cabin, and it came up short. Not dangerously short for October, dangerously short for January if the winter ran hard, and these winters ran hard. I told her. She said, "I know, I've been rationing." I said, "There's a stand of dead pine up the ridge to the east, maybe an hour on horseback." She said, "I can't fell timber alone." "No," I said, "but I can." She didn't argue. She didn't thank me the way people thank you when they feel they owe you something. She just said, "The axe is in the lean-to. The head's solid, but it needs resharpening. There's a whetstone on the second shelf." I sharpened the axe and rode up to the ridge and spent most of the day dropping dead pine and limbing it and cutting it to lengths I could manage on the pack animal. I made 3 trips. By evening, I had enough wood to fill the lean-to and stack another 3 feet beyond it. And even with a hard winter, I thought she'd make it through to April with something to spare. She heard me coming in on the last trip and came out to the yard and stood there while I unloaded. She said, "That's the sound of a lot of wood." "Enough," I said. She said, "I'll need to learn where it's stacked." So I walked her through it. I put her hand on the edge of the lean-to door and told her the arrangement, new wood at the front so she wouldn't have to reach deep, heaviest pieces on the bottom. The kindling splits in a separate pile to the right. She felt it all with her hands, methodical, building the map. When we were done, she stood with her palm flat on the top course of split pine, and she said quietly, "Thank you." Again, just those 2 words. No weight added to them, no apology for needing them. They meant exactly what they said. I split kindling for an hour after that. I don't know why exactly. There was already enough, but my hands wanted something to do. The second day, I checked the cabin's foundation where it met the ground on the north side, the side that would take the winter weather straight on, and found 2 places where the chinking had worked loose. She had a can of clay-and-chinking mix on a shelf in the lean-to, which told me she'd been trying to maintain it herself. But the job needed a second pair of eyes to find what was missing. I worked through the morning repacking the gaps. She brought me water around midday and sat on the chopping block while I worked. She said, "You're quiet." I said, "Yes." She said, "My husband was quiet too. I used to think it was a rancher thing. Now I think it might just be a certain kind of man." I said, "Some men have a lot to say, some don't." She said, "The ones who do usually have less in them." I kept working. She sat there. After a while she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Did the council send you because they were worried about me, or because they thought I was a problem that needed to be solved?" I looked at her. She was facing mostly toward me, her head tilted just slightly, the way she tilted it when she was listening hard. I said, "Worried about you." "And which are you now?" I thought about that honestly. I said, "Neither." She waited. I said, "You're not a problem, and I'm not worried. You're managing this place better than most sighted men I know would manage it alone." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "So why are you still here?" That was a fair question. I didn't have a clean answer for it. I said, "The chinking needed doing." She almost smiled again. The same as before, not quite there but close. The third night the weather cleared and we sat outside after dark, which was her preference. She said she liked to hear the country at night, that you could learn more about what was out there by sound than by sight most of the time, and I thought she was right about that. We sat on the bench outside the cabin door, and I told her some things about my life that I don't usually tell people. I'm not sure why. It wasn't that the talking came easy. It didn't. It never does with me. But she was the kind of listener who doesn't fill the gaps, who lets the silence stay when you need it to stay, and that makes it easier to go on. I told her about the years when I was young and quick to violence, and what that cost me. Not the details, those aren't for telling in a polite context, but the shape of it, the fact of it. That I had done things I had made my peace with but never stopped carrying. She listened. I told her about my wife who died 11 years ago. A fever fast, 3 days from well to gone. She was quiet for a while after that. Then she said, 11 years is a long time to be alone. I said, you learn how to do it. She said, yes, a pause. But you shouldn't have to. She said it simply. Not as a bid, not as a suggestion with something underneath it. Just as a true thing she was saying because she thought it was true. I sat with it. Above us the stars were very clear. The way they get after rain passes through and scrubs the air clean. I know those stars well. I've navigated by them more nights than I can count. But I sat there and looked at them for a minute as if I was seeing them for the first time, which is a strange feeling for a man my age. I said, can I ask you something? Yes. At the well, I said, when you were reaching for the handle and couldn't find it, what were you thinking? She considered this. She said, I was thinking that I needed to find it myself. Not that you needed help. I needed help, she said. I just wasn't going to cry for it. A pause. I'd been crying earlier before you came. I sometimes do that in the mornings, not from sadness exactly, just from the accumulating weight of the alone. And I thought, standing at that well, that's enough. Get the water. She was quiet. Then I heard you. I said, I almost didn't come over right away. I watched for a moment. I know, she said. I could feel you watching. And you didn't call out. No. Why not? She turned her face toward the stars. She did this sometimes when she was thinking, turned toward the open sky. I suppose because I wanted to solve it myself. And because I could feel that whoever was watching wasn't about to let anything bad happen. I said, how could you feel that? She said, stillness, the way you were still. A man who means harm doesn't go that still. I left on the 4th morning. My horse was ready. I had my gear. I checked the windlass one more time, checked the chinking, split another hour's worth of kindling just because I didn't like leaving any task at less than done. The woodpile was solid. The cabin was tight. She had what she needed to get through the winter. I stood in the yard with my horse, and she stood in the doorway, and I said, I'll send someone from the settlement to check on you midwinter. She said, I'd rather you came yourself. I looked at her. She was standing straight, both hands easy at her sides, and her face had the clarity it always had, that listening look, the one that meant she wasn't performing, wasn't being polite, just saying the thing. I said, that's a long ride in winter. She said, I know what it is. I stood there for a moment. My horse turned his head and bumped my shoulder with his nose. He does that when he thinks I'm taking too long, and I put my hand on his neck without looking at him. I said, I'll come in February. She said, all right. That was all, no more words added. She turned and went inside, and the door closed soft. I mounted up and rode north. There's a particular kind of feeling a man gets riding away from something. Not always bad. Sometimes it's relief. Sometimes it's nothing. Sometimes it's a thing with no clean name that sits in your chest like a stone. Not heavy exactly. Not painful exactly. Just present, noticeable, something you're aware of with every breath. I rode the first day and didn't think about much. I watched the country, which is what I do. The grass was going copper and dry at the tips, which meant first frost within 2 weeks. The creek crossings were still passable, but the banks had the look of early season soft going to freeze. In another month you'd want to find higher stone. I noted it, stored it, kept moving. The second day, I stopped at the ridge where I'd cut the pine and looked back south, which you can see a good distance from up there. The creek claim was too far to make out, but I knew roughly where it was, a fold in the land, a cottonwood break, the glint of the well stone if the angle was right. I sat there longer than I needed to. Stans in mourning would want a report when I got back. I was composing it in my mind. The woman is capable. The property is in good order. I shored up the woodpile and rechinked the north wall. She'll make the winter. All of that was true. All of that was what he'd asked me to assess. What he hadn't asked me was what I thought about her voice, or the way she navigated her own yard with such complete confidence, or the fact that she had a mind like a clean river, moving, clear, catching light, or the way she'd said I'd rather you came yourself without flinching, without softening it, just the plain want of it stated like a coordinate on a map. I thought about that sentence for a long time on the trail home. I gave my report to Stans in mourning, and it was what it was. He listened. He nodded. He said, "She'll be all right through winter." I said yes. He said, "Good." He went back to what he'd been doing. The weeks moved. I went about my work. There was always work. There's always something with a band our size in the season turn, horses to move, disputes to settle, trade to coordinate, winter stores to check and recheck. I was busy. I slept. But I thought about her at odd moments. Not obsessively. I'm too old and too practical for that kind of thing. But she'd show up in my mind while I was doing something else. The tilt of her head when she was listening. The juniper smell of the stew. The way she'd put her hand flat on the stacked wood and said thank you like it meant exactly what it said. A man my age has learned something if he's been paying attention. He knows the difference between thinking about someone because they're interesting and thinking about someone because something in you has recognized something in them. The first kind fades. The second kind doesn't. I knew which kind this was by the third week. November came hard, which they sometimes do. 2 big snows before the middle of the month, and the second one was the kind that could bury a road for 2 weeks if the wind set wrong. I thought about the cabin. The north wall chinking, I'd done that right, I was sure of it, but I thought about it. The woodpile, I knew the cubic footage, I'd calculated it, she was fine, but I thought about it. I thought about the windlass rope, which was new and sound. I thought about whether she had oil for the lamp and salt enough, and whether the venison she'd had laid up would last. I rode to the settlement in late November to trade, and made a point of talking to a farmer who ran cattle near the creek claim, about 15 miles from her place. He knew of her. Everyone in the valley knew of her, the blind widow on the north claim, and he said one of his hands had ridden past her place 2 weeks back, and the smoke was coming good from the chimney, and the yard looked maintained. I thanked him. He gave me a look, not unfriendly, curious. He said, "You know the widow?" I said I checked on her in October. Council sent me. He said, "Ah," and the conversation moved on. But I noticed something in myself when he said the widow, a small tightening, like when someone picks up something of yours without asking. Not anger, just a noticing, as if the word widow was too small for her, too simple, as if it was describing only the absence in her life and not the whole of what she was. I rode back in February. I told her February and I meant it, but I left earlier than I'd planned because the weather opened a window I didn't want to miss. 4 days of dry, cold, good firm trail. The creek crossings frosted solid. If I waited, the window might close. I rode the 2 days and came down off the ridge into the creek valley in the afternoon of the second day, and saw the smoke from her chimney rising thin and straight into cold air, which is what smoke does when there's no wind to bend it. She was outside when I came into the yard. She was splitting kindling. She had a small block set up near the door, a hand axe, and she was working methodically, a piece at a time, no waste of motion. She heard the horse before I got to the post, and she stopped and straightened and turned her face toward the sound. She said, "You're early." I got down. I said, "The trail was good." She said, "I thought you might come when the weather opened." She set the hand axe in the block. "I made enough stew yesterday." I stopped. She said, "I know it sounds like I knew. I didn't know. I just thought if he's going to come early, it'll be when the trail's good, and the trail's been good for 2 days. A pause. "So I made stew." I said, "That's good thinking." She said, "I had a good teacher." She was almost smiling now, more than the other times, the shape of it more present in her face, and she turned and went inside, and I tied the horse and followed her. I stayed 6 days that time. The excuse was the same. There were things that needed doing. The hinge on the lean-to door had worked loose over the winter and needed repegging. One of the water barrels had developed a slow seep and needed recoupering. Small things. Things a person living alone and unable to see didn't have a clean way to address. But we both knew the work wasn't the whole reason. We talked more that visit. Long talks in the evenings by the fire, some of them, and some of them barely talking at all, sitting with something between us that didn't need words. She told me about her childhood, the family homestead in Wisconsin, her father who was a great reader and read aloud to all the children every night after supper. She'd loved that. Still carried the books in her head, she said, whole passages of things she'd had read to her enough times that they were just there, available, the way you always know a trail you've ridden 100 times. She asked me about the band, about our winter, the snows, the hunting, the health of the horses. She asked about Stands in Mourning, remembering his name from something I'd mentioned in October. I told her he was well, that he'd asked about her, which was true. On the 4th evening she said, "You could stay." I was quiet. She said, "I'm not saying what I can't say yet. I'm saying the practical thing. This place needs a second pair of hands, and I think," she stopped, started again, "I think you don't have anything pulling you north that pulls you harder than you might be pulled right now." I looked at her for a long time. She couldn't see me looking. She just sat with it, with the offer, with the silence, with whatever I was going to say. I said, "Stands in Mourning would have opinions about it." She said, "Stands in Mourning sent you to see if I was all right. You've seen. What does he send you for next?" I almost laughed. It wasn't quite a laugh. It was a sound that was half a laugh maybe, which is about as far as I usually get, and she heard it, and I think it was the first time she'd heard it from me because something in her face changed. She said, "I've never heard you do that before." I said, "I don't do it often." She said, "You should." I talked to Stands in Mourning in March. He was not a man who wasted time on judgment. He listened to what I told him, all of it, clear. And then he was quiet for a while in the way he went quiet when he was thinking something through properly. Then he said, "Is she a good woman?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you want to go to her?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Then go." A pause. "Send word when you're settled. We're not going to lose track of you." I said, "I know." He said, "She'll need to know she has people, even with you there, that she's not alone in the larger sense." I said I'd tell her. He looked at me for a moment with the kind of look he had sometimes, like he was reading the country of a man's face the way I read the country out a window. Then he said, "You've been alone 11 years. I said, "Yes." He said, "Long enough." I didn't say anything to that, but I felt it land somewhere in me, in a deep place, the kind of place things land when they're true. I rode south in April, when the thaw had firmed the trail enough. I had my gear on 2-pack animals, not everything I owned, but the things that were mine to move, and I came down out of the ridge country in the late morning with the sun on the right side of my face, and the smell of creek water and new grass coming up from the valley. She was at the well when I rode in. She heard me coming from a good distance. She knew the sound of my horse by now, the particular rhythm of it, the way you know any voice you've heard enough times, and she turned from the well and stood with one hand on the stone lip and the other loose at her side. I rode into the yard and stopped and got down. She said, "You brought more than one horse." I said, "Yes." She said, "So you're staying?" I said, "If that's still what you want." She walked toward me. She didn't reach out with her hands to find me. She knew where I was. She tracked the sound of me getting down from the horse, and she walked right to me and stopped when she was close and put her hand flat on my chest, just below the shoulder. She stood there with her hand flat on my chest, and I stood still and let her feel it, whatever she was feeling. My heartbeat maybe, just the fact of me being there. She said, "It's what I want." That was all. The sun was just past morning high, and the creek was running clear and cold somewhere in the cottonwoods, and there were birds starting up the way they do in April, filling in the spaces between sounds with something bright and purposeless, just the noise of things being alive. I put my hand over hers where it lay on my chest. We stood like that for a while, in the yard in the sun, with no particular reason to move. Stands in Morning sent a young cousin of mine with a message in July. The message said, "Word is you fixed yourself to the blind widow on the North Claim. Good. Don't forget us." I sent back, "I know where you are." Marin asked me what it said when I read it to her, and I told her. She said, "Do you need to go see him?" I said, "Not until fall." She said, "We could ride up together in September, when the trail's better." I looked at her. She was sitting at the table with her hands flat on its surface, the way she sat when she was thinking clearly, braced, present. She said it like it was a practical thing. "We could ride up, the way you say we could bring in the last of the firewood today if the weather holds." I said, "You'd come with me." She said, "You didn't think I'd stay behind." I said, "I didn't know if you'd want to make that ride." She said, "I'm not delicate." I said, "I know." She said, "Then stop looking at me like you're surprised." I wasn't surprised. I don't know exactly what I was. There's a feeling a man gets that doesn't have a word in any language I know, when something he'd stopped expecting comes and sits down next to him as if it belonged there all along, as if it had simply been late, as if it had been traveling toward him for years through difficult country and had finally arrived. Not disbelief. Not even gratitude exactly, just a deep, unlanguaged recognition. I said, "September." She said, "September," and went back to what she'd been doing. Outside the window the light on the plains was long and gold, and the cottonwoods along the creek were starting to go, just the edges of them, just the first bits of yellow and all that green. A month, maybe 6 weeks, before the turn was complete. Good country, I thought. Hard country. The kind that takes everything from you if you let it and gives you nothing back unless you know how to look. I looked at her hands flat on the table. I looked at the way the light came through the south window and fell across the side of her face. I thought, I know how to look.